Industrial Revolution. Introduction. After Middle Ages, feudalism as an economic system was declining, furthered by Renaissance and Enlightenment. Growth in trade led to rise of cities and towns, which further led to production of manufactured goods. Increase in demand for goods which were previously considered luxurious, such as cotton clothes, with a rise in standard of living. All these factors stimulated production of manufactured goods, as traditional methods were inadequate to meet growing demands. From mid-18th century onwards, began a series of changes which revolutionized techniques and organization of production. Resulted in a new type of economy, industrial economy. Capitalism and colonization. New system of society which was emerging in Europe from 15th century. Under which instruments and means by which goods are produced are owned by private individuals and production is carried out for making profits. Workers do not own anything but work for a wage. Owners of wealth are capitalists, invested to make a profit. Feudalism. Capitalism. Economic life under feudalism was static as goods were produced for local consumption and there was no incentive to produce more by employing better means of producing goods for a bigger market. Economy life under capitalism was fast-moving with the aim of producing more and more goods for bigger markets so that more profits could be made. Discovery of new lands and establishment of colonies resulted in unprecedented expansion of trade and accumulation of wealth by merchants. Colonization was accompanied by the plunder of the wealth of the people who were colonized. Treasures of the Inca and Aztec were plundered by the Spaniards. Mines of conquered areas were exploited for natural resources such as gold and silver, South America and Africa. Slave labor in plantations in Americas and East Asia. Karl Marx said treasures captured outside Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder floated back to the mother country and were turned into capital. Industrial Revolution. Desire to produce more goods at low cost to make higher profits led to industrial revolution and further growth of capitalism. Industrial revolution began around 1750 when machines started to take over some of the work done by people and animals in productions of goods and commodities and was beginning of machine age. After 1750, new inventions came much faster than ever before that brought rapid changes in people's lives. Industrial revolution changed man's way of living and thinking all over the world. Guild system had given way to domestic or putting out system before factories. In putting out, work is contracted by a central agent to subcontractors who complete the work in off-site facilities, either in their own homes or in workshops with multiple craftsmen. Factory system. In place of simple tools and the use of animal and manual power, new machines and steam power came to be increasingly used. Many new cities sprang up and artisans and dispossessed peasants went there to work. Everything required for production was provided by the capitalists for the workers who were brought together under one roof. Everything belonged to the owner of the factory, including the finished product, and workers worked for wages. Why industrial revolution in England? Vast profits through overseas trade, including slave trade, profits necessary for capital. Emerged as unrivaled power in trade rivalries abroad, hence could ensure regular supply of raw materials. No shortage of labor after disappearance of serfdom and enclosure movement, holdings were consolidated, and large army of landless unemployed people was created. Stable government no longer under the domination of feudal classes and commercial class acquired more political power. Natural resources. England had plenty of natural resources such as iron and coal, essential for industries. Transportation. England had large shipping industry and had no problems of transportation. No other country enjoyed all these advantages at this period. Some suffered from a lack of capital or natural resources, and some from an unfavorable political system. Many of them, such as Italy and Germany, were not even united and suffered from many economic restrictions. Textile industry. 1700s English East India Company was sending cotton from India to England. Soon, calico cloth made in Calicut, and Dhaka muslin, and Kashmir shawls were in great demand. Soon businessmen began to import cotton and make it into cloth in England. When the workers using old-fashioned spinning wheels and hand looms could not keep up with the increasing demand, a series of inventions came along to make faster spinning and weaving possible. 1764, Hargreaves invented spinning jenny which speeded up spinning. Arkwright adapted this machine for running with water. Crompton, sometime later, combined the advantages of the machines invented by Hargreaves and Arkwright. These three inventions alone made it possible for England to produce thread that was finer and cheaper than any that could be produced by others or with older techniques. In 1785, Cartwright invented a power loom. This machine could be run by horses or bullocks, and later, when factories were set up along rivers and canals, water power was used to operate it. Steam engine by James Watt in 1769 revolutionized production, as men or animals couldn't compete with power of steam engine. Blast furnace. With steam power, there was a demand for more machinery. Development of blast furnace and later method of turning low-grade iron into steel enabled industries to produce steel cheaply. Now they could make better and more machines. Transport and communications revolution. Railways. In 1814, George Stephenson developed steam engine to haul coal from mines to ports by railways. In 1830, the first railway train began to carry passengers and freight from Liverpool to Manchester. These events were followed by a great wave of railroad construction in England and the United States. In 1853, under Lord Dalhousie, the first railroad was laid in India. Roads need to transport raw materials and manufactured products led to the improvement of roads and the digging of canals in England and other countries. Macadams devised the method of making pakka or macadamized roads. Canal building. These spread to Europe and America and was a big help in providing cheaper transportation, especially after steamboats came into use. Posts. Improved transportation helped in carrying messages, people and goods. Penny post began to operate in England in early 19th century. Business concerns took advantage of the penny post in their buying and selling transactions far and near. Agricultural revolution. Farm mechanization. Changes in farm methods to produce more food, cash crops, and raw materials for industries. New farm machinery such as steel plow and harrow for breaking ground, mechanical drill for seeding, and horse-drawn cultivator. Crop rotation, intensive manuring and practice of crop rotation to maintain soil fertility, a departure from Middle Ages when third-year land was left fallow. Land consolidation. Big landholders took over the common meadow in a village, also leaving the small landowners and tenants with no pasture. But the big landowners controlled parliament in those days and got laws passed that enabled them to do these things. This and enclosure movement meant peasants were forced off land. Beginning of Pax Britannica. Little more than 50 years after the use of machines began, England had become the world's leading industrial nation. In first half of 19th century, textile exports to India jumped from 50,000 kilograms to well over 2.5 million kg. Amount of coal mined rose from 15 to 64 million tons and became an important export. Production of pig iron increased from 690,000 tons to over 3 million, enough to supply all the machinery and hardware needed at home, besides sending vast quantities to other countries. Tariffs. As England was first country where industries developed, gained complete control over world markets. Even with machines, countries couldn't compete with scale of English industries. Levy of tariffs to protect new industries became a widespread practice. Colonies couldn't do that, hence local economy was destroyed. Elsewhere in world. Germany by 1865 occupied second place as a producer of steel, but with England far ahead in the lead. After a late start, Germany's industrial development took an amazing leap after 1870 when the German states were finally welded into one nation. Soon Germany was to become England's rival. United States had introduced machines and started factories before 1800, after gaining independence from England. By 1860, had well-established textile, steel, and shoe industries. The American industries grew very rapidly after 1870. Japan was the first country in Asia to industrialize. Traditionally, Japan produced mainly such articles as silk, porcelain, and toys. By the end of the 19th century, Japanese production included steel, machinery, metal goods, and chemicals, and in quantities large enough for export. Race for raw materials. Search for markets and sources of raw materials resulted in international rivalries. First England, later, other Western countries began to look for new sources of raw materials and markets for their manufactures. Towards the end of the 19th century, Japan was industrialized and joined the race. This race, almost the entire non-industrialized world was carved up into colonies, spheres of influence, or territories, for economic and political domination by industrialized countries. Thus arose imperialism, under which strong nations subordinated the economies of the countries under their domination to their own interests. They forced them to buy and sell on their own terms. Urbanization and Industrial Revolution. Earlier, most population lived in villages and was connected to land. All economic needs of people were met within the village itself. Cities were center of craft and political control. With industries, new cities and towns that grew were important more as centers of industry than as political and administrative centers. Large part of the population now started living in cities where thousands of people worked in industrial establishments. This population was not connected with land. Now, in some industrialized countries, less than 20% of the population is connected with land. Crowding of people into cities has always produced problems of housing, health, and sanitation. The quickening pace of industrialization in England created deplorable living conditions, concentration in smoky industrial towns, and city slums grew worse. Social bonds were dissolved and man became freer to develop capabilities, for better or worse. Industrial Revolution created an international consciousness among peoples because the developments in one place began to influence the developments in other places. Industrial capitalism resulted in concentration of economic power in few hands who came to control the lives of not only a large number of workers whom they employed but also, directly or indirectly, the economic life of the entire society. Resulted in shocking social inequalities and created a wide gulf between capitalists and the rest of the population. Workers had to accept whatever wage was offered to them because usually there were more people than jobs. Women and children were hired in mines because they could be hired for less wages. Condition of workers. Housing provided for workers were no better. Whole areas of the industrial cities where workers lived were crowded slums. Accidents, disease and epidemics were common. No social security. Workers could be dismissed at the pleasure of employer, fired during slack period. Labor laws and trade union. Humanitarian reformers and some landowners who were jealous of big businessmen combined with English workers to get the first laws to improve conditions of work. In 1802, First Factory Act passed, limiting hours of children's work to 12 days. In 1819, forbade employment of children under 9. By 1824, workers succeeded in getting laws against unions repealed, leading to remarkable growth in unions. In 1830s and 40s, movement to get right of vote to workers known as Chartist movement was launched. The many benefits that workers and all salaried people enjoy in most industrialized countries today are due directly or indirectly to the efforts to correct the terrible conditions that the Industrial Revolution brought about. Laissez-faire and capitalism. When Industrial Revolution was gaining strength in England and in other countries, the growing belief was that governments should not interfere with business and industry. Laissez-faire or leave us alone was then a kind of religion among capitalists. According to the laissez-faire idea, the businessman should be free to look after his own interests. Only the unwritten law of supply and demand should determine the size of his profits. The same unwritten law would determine the fate of the worker, whether he had a job, what would be his working conditions and salary. Adam Smith voiced this idea in 1776 in a book called The Wealth of Nations, and it had many supporters, too. Socialism. Greatest challenge to laissez-faire, and to capitalism itself, has come from the idea of socialism, which grew in the beginning as a reaction against the evils of capitalism. However, they came to believe that, for basic improvement in their life, socialism or a complete reordering of society was essential. Industrialization and capitalism brought benefits as well as hardships and evils to man: unemployment, smoky, crowded cities, unhealthy living and working conditions, rivalry and conflict between nations. As working men got the right to vote and elect their representatives in government, they forced the passage of laws that eliminated many of the early evils that industrialization had brought about. Ideas of socialism also arose which, while recognizing the importance of machines and making them even better, aimed at solving the problems created by capitalism by building a new social order. World in 18th century, an American Revolution. Feudalism to nation-states. Under feudalism, societies were divided into classes, some of which were privileged while the others were exploited. A man's entire life was determined at the time of his birth, depending on the class into which he was born. Two main classes were feudal lords and serfs. Kings claimed divine rights, that their power was derived from God. Boundaries of states also were irrational. There were all kinds of states: empires, feudal estates, city-states. Territories within a state were not necessarily contiguous. Territories inhabited by homogeneous people were divided into number of states under local ruler, church or an empire. The middle class played a great role in bringing about Renaissance and acquired economic power through trade and commerce. However, they were now obstructed in their growth by outdated political system based on privilege. With Industrial Revolution, strength of this class and a new class, that of industrial workers, grew. Both were opposed to autocratic political systems. Serfdom had declined in some countries, but in most other countries of Europe, it was still the dominant feature of the social system. There were many revolts of the serfs, but they were suppressed. First successful revolution which overthrew the autocratic monarchy took place in England in the 17th century. Also rise of national consciousness and movements to unite different territories, if were divided as different states or ruled by imperial powers. Renaissance had inaugurated an era of questioning established beliefs and was a cultural movement. Great progress was made in various sciences, which also undermined the existing beliefs. New ideas were characterized by rationalism and were increasingly concerned with secular affairs. Because of the growing emphasis on reason, the period of the 18th century in European history is called the Age of Enlightenment. Beliefs that allowed people to be categorized into higher or lower groups on the basis of birth and hold of church in sphere of ideas were undermined. New ideas were ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity. Thus arose ideas of freedom, democracy and equality, which became the rallying slogans of peoples everywhere. Simultaneously, also arose ideas of nationalism which brought a sense of unity and oneness to the people forming a nation and the desire to organize themselves into independent states with their distinctive national identities. Revolution is a drastic or radical change. It can be sudden overthrow of established authority or system by force or gradual change through peaceful means. Revolution involves fundamental change in entire political system, nature of government, and aims of government, and class that holds power. Revolutions have played an essential role in the development of human societies. Without them, one kind of system, however unsuitable for the times it might be, would continue forever and there would be no progress. American Revolution, the English colonies. While some Englishmen were battling at home for improvements in Parliament and reforms in religion, others were adventuring across the Atlantic to establish colonies and trade in the Americas. In 16th century, European countries began to make settlements there. In North America, colonies were established by France, Holland and Spain as well as by England. In 18th century, England drove France out of the eastern part of the continent and Canada. By mid-18th century there were 13 English colonies in North America along the Atlantic coast. Landless peasants, people seeking religious freedom, traders, and profiteers had settled there with bulk of the population consisted of independent farmers. Different industries had developed in such products as wool, flax, and leather. North there were fishing and shipbuilding, and in the south, large plantations like feudal manors had grown up where tobacco and cotton were grown with slave labor brought from Africa. Each colony had a local assembly elected by qualified voters. These assemblies enacted laws concerning local matters and levied taxes. However, they were under the rule of the mother country. Causes of revolution. Colonial policy of England in economic matters was the primary cause of resentment in the American colonies. England's policies did not encourage the American colonies to develop an economy of their own. Trade English Parliament had forbidden them to use non-British ships in their trade. Tobacco, cotton, sugar could only be exported to England. Heavy duties on import of goods from other places. Colonies also forbidden to start iron or textile industries. Land English also angered the colonists by issuing a proclamation to prevent them from moving west into new lands. English aristocrats had bought lands in America and got rents from the farmers. They wanted to keep the colonists as renters. Taxes. As a result of continuous wars in Europe, government was burdened with debt. 1765, the English Parliament passed the Stamp Act which imposed stamp taxes on all business transactions in the American colonies. Aroused violent resentment among all sections of the colonists and led them to boycott English goods. There were uprisings in many towns and tax collectors were killed. Colonists claimed that, since English Parliament had no representatives from the colonies, it had no right to levy taxes on them. Revenue from these taxes was used not in the interests of the colonies but of English. Ideas. American revolutionaries were inspired by the ideas of the English philosophers of the 17th century. These philosophers, Locke, Harrington, Milton, believed that men had certain fundamental rights which no government had the right to infringe. Jefferson and Paine, in common sense, were other vocal leaders for the cause of independence. Events leading up to war. Leaders called a meeting at Massachusetts and proclaimed no taxation without representation. Threatened to stop import of British goods, which led to repeal of Stamp Act. However, new taxes on consumer goods were imposed, such as glass, tea, paint, paper. Once again Americans protested and cut down imports from Britain to half. English withdrew the taxes except on tea as its symbolic power posturing. Tax on tea led to trouble. In 1773, several colonies refused to unload the tea coming in English ships. The governor ordered a ship to be unloaded. Group of citizens dressed as American Indians dumped the crates into sea. Incident is known as Boston Tea Party. English government then closed the port of Boston to all trade and precipitated the uprising of the colonies. Representatives of the 13 American colonies met as a group in what is called the First Continental Congress at Philadelphia in 1774. This Congress appealed to the English king to remove restrictions on industries and trade and not to impose any taxes without their consent. Declared their action a mutiny and ordered troops to be sent to suppress it. The colonies then planned for military defense with local troops or militia. Declaration on 4th July 1776. The Second Continental Congress asserted that all men are created equal. Congress adopted the declaration of that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Till this time the colonists had been fighting for their rights as Englishmen. After the declaration in 1776, they fought for their right to be an independent nation. War of Independence. George Washington was in command of American forces. First battles took in and around Boston. Initial victory of American colonial militia against trained British Army gave Americans confidence. French government also decided to help the colonies with troops, supplies and funds to embarrass the English, France's old enemy. The enemies of English, Spain and Holland, were soon fighting the English elsewhere. Some leaders in Parliament were also against war with colonists and their troubles brewing at home in Ireland. War ended in 1781 when the English commander, Cornwallis, later to become Governor-General in India, surrendered. In 1783, Treaty of Paris was signed and the English recognized the independence of its 13 former colonies. American Constitution. When the War of Independence started, each of the 13 colonies was a separate state with its own army, boundaries, customs duties and finances. But they cooperated against a common enemy. Constitutional Convention was called in Philadelphia to frame a new constitution, which came into effect in 1789. American Constitution established a republican form of government at a time when states in other parts of the world were governed by monarchies. Jefferson and followers campaigned for Bill of Rights to be added to Constitution, which was done by 10 amendments. It was the first written Republican Constitution ever framed in history, which is still in operation. Significance. Words of the Declaration of Independence regarding the equality of all men and the inalienable rights of man electrified the atmosphere in America and outside. Lafayette, French general who fought for Americans, was soon to become a hero of the French Revolution. Thomas Paine also participated in the French Revolution. Inspired many revolutionaries in Europe later in the 19th century. It encouraged Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Central and South America to rebel and gain their independence. Main achievement of the American Revolution was the establishment of a republic. This republic was, however, not truly democratic. Right to vote was limited. Negroes, most of them still slaves, American Indians, and women had no vote. Growth of a nation USA added Florida, Spain, Louisiana, France, and won territories from Mexico and expanded till Pacific coast. Increased settlement in West brought slave-owning southern states, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, and industrial capitalists northern states, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, in conflict. Led to Civil War BW 1861 to 1865 and defeat of southern states and abolition of slavery. Causes. Southern leaders said that the Republican policy of blocking the expansion of slavery into the West made them second-class citizens, and they also said it challenged their autonomy. Sectionalism resulted from the different economies, social structure, customs and political values of the North and South. Slave owners preferred low-cost manual labor with no mechanization. Northern manufacturing interests supported tariffs and protectionism while Southern planters demanded free trade. Received insults to Southern collective honor included the enormous popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, and the actions of abolitionist John Brown in trying to incite a slave rebellion in 1859. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final trigger for secession, feared that Lincoln would stop the expansion of slavery and put it on a course toward extinction. Reconstruction era, 1863 to 1877, overlapped and followed the war, with the process of restoring national unity, strengthening the national government, and granting civil rights to freed black slaves throughout the country. French Revolution. It was brewing when American War of Independence was being fought. French Revolution was more world-shaking than the American one. It became a widespread upheaval over which no one could remain neutral. Conditions in France were no worse than conditions in other parts of Europe. Autocratic and extravagant rulers, privileged nobles and clergy, landless peasants and jobless workers, unequal taxation, these were some of the common hardships endured by people. France was a strong and powerful state in the 18th century, and had seized vast territories in North America, islands in the West Indies. First and Second Estate. Privileged class. Also known as population. Clergy. First Estate. 1.3 lakh clerics. Nobility. Second Estate. 80,000 families. These classes were exempted from all taxes, controlled most of the administrative posts and all the high-ranking posts in the army. Also together owned about 40% of the total land of France. Their incomes came primarily from their large land holdings. A minority of these also depended on pensions and gifts from the king. They considered it beneath their dignity to trade or to be engaged in manufacture or to do any work. The life of the nobility was everywhere characterized by extravagance and luxury. There were some poorer sections in these two top estates. They were discontented and blamed the richer members of their class for their misery. Third Estate, rest of the people of France. Numbered about 95% of the total population and were the unprivileged people. Largest section consisted of peasants, almost 80% of total population. Most of the peasants were free, unlike the serfs in the Middle Ages. Great majority of the French peasants were landless or had very small holdings. Plight of tenants and sharecroppers was worse. After rents, could only save 1/3 or a quarter of what he produced. Certain changes in agriculture in 18th century France worsened conditions of peasant. No longer take wood from forests or use uncultivated land for grazing. Forced labor for public works by feudal lord was common practice. Taxes for local roads, bridges and churches were inevitable. A bad harvest in such circumstances led to starvation and unrest. Middle class or bourgeoisie consisted of the educated people, writers, doctors, judges, lawyers, teachers, civil servants, and the richer people who were merchants, bankers, and manufacturers. This class was forerunner of the builders of the industries, which were to transform economic and social life in the 19th century. Since these people had money, the state, the clergy, and the nobility were indebted to them. However, the middle class had no political rights. It had no social status, and its members had to suffer many humiliations. Condition of the city poor, workers and artisans, was inhuman in the 18th century France. They were looked upon as inferior creatures without any rights. No worker could leave his job for another without the employer's consent and a certificate of good conduct. This group was to become the mainstay of the French Revolution. Monarchy at the head of the French state stood the king, an absolute monarch. Louis XVI was the king of France when the revolution broke out. He was a man of mediocre intelligence, obstinate and indifferent to the work of the government. His wife, Marie Antoinette, squandered money on festivities and interfered in state appointments in order to promote her favorites. The state was always faced by financial troubles, as one would expect. Keeping huge armies and waging wars made matters worse. Finally, it brought the state to bankruptcy. Intellectual movement. Discontent or even wretchedness is not enough to make a successful revolution. Someone must help the discontented to focus on an enemy and provide ideals to fight for. Revolutionary thinking and ideas must precede revolutionary action. France in the 18th century had many revolutionary thinkers. Without the ideas spread by these philosophers, the French Revolution would simply have been an outbreak of violence. Rationalism. Because of the ideas expressed by the French intellectuals, the 18th century has been called the Age of Reason. Christianity had taught that man was born to suffer. However, philosophers argued that man was born to be happy. They believed that man can attain happiness if reason is allowed to destroy prejudice and reform man's institutions. They urged faith in reason. Power of reason alone, they said, was sufficient to build a perfect society. Attack on clergy. Clergy were the first to feel the brunt of the French philosophers. Scientific advances dating from the Renaissance helped in their campaign against the clergy. Voltaire, one of the most famous French writers of the time, though not an atheist, believed all religions absurd and contrary to reason. Voltaire, other philosophers, atheists and materialists, gained popularity. They believed that man's destiny lay in this world rather than in heaven. Theory of laissez-faire had gained currency in French economists, known as physiocrats. Taxes should be imposed only with the consent of those on whom they were levied. These ideas were a direct denial of the privileges and feudal rights that protected the upper classes. Democracy philosopher-writer Montesquieu thought about the kind of government that is best suited to man and outlined the principles of constitutional monarchy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who asserted the doctrine of popular sovereignty and democracy, said, "Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains." He talked of the state of nature when man was free, and said that freedom was lost following the emergence of property. What was needed, said Rousseau, was a new social contract to guarantee the freedom, equality and happiness which man had enjoyed in the state of nature. Outbreak of revolution. In 1789, Louis XVI's need for money compelled him to agree to a meeting of the Estates General, the old feudal assembly. Louis wanted to obtain its consent for new loans and taxes. Three estates were represented in it, but each one held a separate meeting. On 17 June 1789, members of the Third Estate, claiming to represent 95% of the nation's population, declared themselves the National Assembly. On 20 June, they found their meeting hall occupied by royal guards, but, determined to meet, they moved to the nearby Royal Tennis Court to work out a constitution, known as Tennis Court Oath. Louis then made preparations to break up the assembly. Troops were called. Rumors spread that leading members of the assembly would soon be arrested. This enraged the people, who began to gather in their thousands. They were soon joined by the guards. They surrounded the Bastille, a state prison. On 14 July, they broke open the doors and freed all the prisoners. Fall of Bastille symbolized the fall of autocracy. After fall of Bastille. After 14 July 1789, Louis XVI was king only in name. The National Assembly began to enact laws. Revolt spread to other towns and cities and into countryside. National Assembly adopted the famous Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. It specified the equality of all men before the law, eligibility of all citizens for all public offices, freedom from arrest or punishment without proven cause, freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Most importantly, to the middle class, it required equitable distribution of the burdens of taxation and rights of private property. This was quite revolutionary, as every government in Europe was based on privilege. These ideas were applied, the entire old order of Europe would be destroyed. War and Republic of France. People were soon involved in a war to defend the revolution and the nation. Many nobles and clerics fled the country and encouraged other European autocrats to intervene in France against the revolution. The king and queen tried to escape from France in disguise, but they were recognized and brought back as captives and traitors. Old National Assembly was replaced by a Legislative Assembly. This assembly took over the property of those people who had fled. It sent word to the Austrian emperor, who was mobilizing support against France to renounce every treaty directed against the French nation. When the emperor refused, the Legislative Assembly declared war. France had destroyed feudalism and monarchy and founded new institutions based on liberty and equality, whereas in these countries the old way of life remained. The commander-in-chief of the Austro-Prussian forces stated that the aim was to suppress anarchy in France and to restore the king's authority. The French revolutionaries replied by offering fraternity and assistance to all people wishing to destroy the old order in their countries. A radical group, the Jacobins, believing in direct democracy, came to power. Hearing that the revolution was in danger, this group took to strong measures to crush forces inimical to the revolution. In 14 months, some 17,000 people, including those who were innocent, were tried and executed. This period was called Reign of Terror. Later, a new constitution was drawn up. But the army became increasingly powerful, and this led to the rise of Napoleon, who was soon to declare himself Emperor of the French Republic. Napoleonic Wars. From 1792 to 1815, France was engaged in war almost continuously. It was a war between France and other states. Some have termed it as an international civil war because it was fought between revolutionary France and countries upholding the old order. In this war, France was alone. Till Napoleon became emperor, almost every enlightened person in the world sympathized with the French Revolution. Between 1793 and 1796, French armies conquered almost all of Western Europe. After Napoleon became emperor, France recovered the territories she had lost and defeated Austria in 1805, Prussia in 1806, and Russia in 1807. On the sea, the French could not score against the stronger British navy. Finally, an alliance of almost all Europe defeated France at Leipzig in 1813. These allied forces later occupied Paris, and Napoleon was defeated. The attempt at recovery was foiled at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. The peace settlement, which involved all Europe, took place at the Congress of Vienna. The Bourbon dynasty was reinstalled as the ruler. However, within a few years, in 1830, there was another outbreak of revolution. In 1848, the monarchy was again overthrown, though it soon reappeared. Finally, in 1871, the Republic was again proclaimed, Third Republic till 1940. Napoleon ideas that underpin our modern world, meritocracy, equality before the law, property rights, religious toleration, modern secular education, sound finances, and so on, were championed, consolidated, codified and geographically extended by Napoleon. To them he added a rational and efficient local administration, an end to rural banditry, the encouragement of science and the arts, the abolition of feudalism, and the greatest codification of law since the fall of the Roman Empire. Consequences of revolution. Destruction of feudalism. All the laws of the old feudal regime were annulled. Such lands and lands held in common by the community were bought by the middle classes. The lands of nobles were confiscated. Privileged classes were abolished. Napoleon Code. In Europe, many elements of this code remained in force for a long time. Some of them exist even to this day. The term nation got its modern meaning. Nation is not the territory that the people belonging to it inhabit but the people themselves. France was not merely the territories known as France but the French people. Idea of sovereignty. A nation recognizes no law or authority above its own. People constituting the nation are the source of all power and authority. There cannot be any rulers above the people, only a republic in which the government derives its authority from the people and is answerable to the people. Military of the sovereign entire nation was united behind the army which consisted of revolutionary citizens. In a war in which almost all of Europe was ranged against France, they would have had no chance with just a mercenary army. Under the Jacobin constitution, all people were given the right to vote and the right of insurrection. Government must provide the people with work or livelihood, and aim of happiness of all was proclaimed. Though it was never really put into effect, it was the first genuinely democratic constitution in history. Pact of Revolution. Inspired revolutionary movements in almost every country of Europe and in South and Central America. The old ruling dynasty of France had been restored to power in 1815, and the autocratic governments of Europe found themselves safe for the time being. The rulers found it increasingly difficult to rule the people. French soldiers, wherever they went, carried with them ideas of liberty and equality, shaking the old feudal order. Destroyed serfdom in areas which came under their occupation and modernized the systems of administration. Political and social systems of the 18th century had received a heavy blow. They were soon to die in most of Europe under the impact of the revolutionary movements that sprang up everywhere in Europe. Revolutionary France had abolished slavery in her colonies. Former French colony of Haiti became a republic. This was the first republic established by the black people, formerly slaves, in the Americas. During early 19th century, these two imperialist countries, Spain and Portugal, were cut off from their colonies, with the result that most of the Portuguese and Spanish colonies in Central and South America became independent. Nationalism in Europe. Nationalism emerged as a major force in this period. However, it was neither exclusive nor chauvinistic. Inspired by the aim of fighting against despotism everywhere. South American revolutionaries O'Higgins, Simon Bolivar, and San Martin fought for the independence of many countries in South America. Mazzini, one of the foremost leaders of the struggle for Italian unification and independence, formed a number of organizations such as Young Poland, Young Germany, and Young Italy for the liberation of these countries. Giuseppe Garibaldi, another great leader of the Italian revolutionaries, fought for the freedom of the peoples of South America. Autocratic governments also were united to suppress every revolt and movement against any despotism. Holy Alliance. 1815, rulers of Austria, Britain, Russia and Prussia formed an alliance. One of the major declared aims of this alliance was to suppress any attempt by the people to overthrow a ruler whom these countries considered the legitimate ruler of the country. France joined soon. Austria, Russia and Prussia had formed another alliance which they called the Holy Alliance. In many countries, the freedom of the press was abolished and a large number of spies were recruited to keep watch on the activities of the revolutionaries. 1830 revolutions broke out in a number of countries. The French monarch fled away to England and was succeeded by Louis Philippe, who promised to rule according to the wishes of the people. Although most of these revolts were suppressed, the independence of two new nations was recognized, of Greece in 1830 and of Belgium in 1839. Revolutions of 1848. Within a few years after the revolts of 1830 had been suppressed, the revolutionary movements in Europe again gained momentum. 1848, revolutions broke out in almost every country of Europe, which dealt a mortal blow to the countries of the Holy Alliance. France's power was usurped through a coup by Louis Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon, in 1852, who ruled till 1870. Prussia uprisings followed in many towns, and rulers had to agree to several reforms. Austrian Empire in those days was a large empire ruling over many nations of Europe. Ruled over Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, Yugoslavia and many other areas, and had its share of uprisings. Revolts were suppressed, however, empire was badly shaken. The most significant aspect of the 1848 revolutions was the emergence of a new political force in Europe. Workers were a major force in the revolutions of 1848. Their aim was not merely the overthrow of autocracies, but also the destruction of the economic system that had grown with the Industrial Revolution, capitalism. Other participants in the revolutions, the capitalists, the merchants and other people belonging to the middle class, wanted constitutional reforms. Looked upon the demands of the workers for social revolution with horror. When the revolutionary movements were at their peak, they decided to compromise with the rulers. Democracy in England. The first successful revolution that overthrew the autocratic monarchy took place in England in 17th century. This had resulted in the establishment of the supremacy of Parliament in England. However, Parliament at that time was not a truly democratic institution. Right to vote was limited to a very small percentage of the population. Throughout 18th and 19th centuries, demand for making Parliament a democratic institution grew. Campaigns to extend the right to vote to every citizen were waged, led by radical leaders who represented the interests of workers and the city poor, and by those representing the industrialists. Chartist movement was launched to get the right to vote for workers. Though the movement declined in the 1850s, it left its influence, and through the Acts of 1867, 1882, 1918 and by 1929, all adult citizens were enfranchised. Over 200 years after Parliament became supreme, that it became also a truly representative body of the British people. Unification of Germany. Great Britain Belgium -1 SC Le WIF Holstein MECKLien Schwerin Prussia KGD. Saxony Bohemia Bavaria Wörth. In the 18th century, Germany was divided into a number of states. Some of these states were very small and did not extend beyond the limits of a city. During the Napoleonic Wars, many of these states ceased to exist. At the end of the wars, there were still 38 independent states in Germany. Among them Prussia, Württemberg, Bavaria, and Saxony were fairly large. Prussia was the most powerful in militarily and in extent. It was also the most reactionary. Big landlords of Prussia known as Junkers formed the dominant section in Prussian society. Prussia was also one of the leaders of the Holy Alliance. With the growth of national consciousness, after French Revolution, people of these states started demanding national unification of Germany, establishment of democratic government, and social and economic reforms. In 1815, German states along with Austria were organized into a Germanic Confederation. However, each state tried to preserve its independence and its oppressive political and social system. 1848, revolts occurred in every German state and the rulers were forced to grant democratic constitutions. To unite Germany and to frame a constitution for the united Germany, a constituent assembly met in Frankfurt. This assembly proposed the unification of Germany as a constitutional monarchy under the King of Prussia who would become Emperor of Germany. He did not wish to accept the crown from the elected representatives of the people, but from College of Electors. Repression soon followed, and even the rights that people had won in the initial stages of the revolution were taken away. Thousands of German revolutionaries had to flee the country and live in exile. With failure of the revolution of 1848 to unify Germany, it was to be unified not into a democratic country by the efforts of revolutionaries, but by the rulers into a militaristic empire. The leader of this policy was Bismarck, who belonged to a Prussian aristocratic family. He wanted to preserve the predominance of the landed aristocrats and the army in the united German state and to achieve the unification of Germany under the leadership of the Prussian monarchy. Bismarck followed a policy of blood and iron, which meant a policy of war. The first aim he pursued was the elimination of Austria from the Germanic Confederation. He aligned with Austria in war against Denmark for possession of Schleswig and Holstein, and then against Austria in alliance with Italy. After defeating Austria, he eliminated them from Germanic Confederation. In place of the old confederation, he united 22 states of Germany into North German Confederation in 1866. The constitution of this confederation made the King of Prussia the hereditary head of the confederation. 1866, most mid-sized German states had opposed Prussia, but by 1870 these states had been coerced and coaxed into mutually protective alliances with Prussia. In the event that a European state declared war on one of their members, they all would come to the defense of the attacked state. With skillful manipulation of European politics, Bismarck created a situation in which France would play the role of aggressor in German affairs, while Prussia would play that of the protector of German rights and liberties. In 1870–71, southern kingdoms joined became German Empire. Alsace-Lorraine was annexed from France in 1870 in war. 1870, Louis Bonaparte, whose power had begun to collapse, declared war on Prussia in the hope of maintaining his empire through a military victory. The war was partly provoked by Bismarck. French armies were defeated and the French emperor was captured. After her defeat, France finally became a republic. Germany's unification was completed as a result of the war, which enabled Bismarck to absorb the remaining German states into a united Germany. The formal ceremony at which King William I of Prussia took the title of German Emperor was not held on German soil. It took place at Versailles in France, in the palace of the French kings. Germany soon underwent heavy industrialization in a very short period and soon joined the scramble for colonies. Unification of Italy. Kingdom Sardini Tuscany aus Arano and times Papi al. Stat. Like Germany, Italy was also divided into a number of states. The major states in the early 19th century Italy were Sardinia, Lombardy, Venetia, Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Sicily and Naples, Papal States, Tuscany, Parma and Modena. Of these the most powerful was the Kingdom of Sardinia. Venetia and Lombardy were under Austrian occupation. Thus the Italian people were faced with the task of expelling the Austrians and forcing the rulers of independent states to unite. Risorgimento was an ideological and literary movement that helped to arouse the national consciousness of the Italian people, and it led to a series of political events that freed the Italian states from foreign domination and united them politically. Struggle for Italian independence and unification was organized by the two famous revolutionaries of Italy, Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi, and their secret society, the Carbonari. The movement led by them is known as the Young Italy movement. It aimed at the independence and unification of Italy and the establishment of a republic there. 1848, as in other parts of Europe, revolutionary uprisings had broken out in Italy and the rulers were forced to grant certain democratic reforms to the people. However, the goal of independence and unification was still distant. The King of Sardinia had introduced many reforms in the political system of his kingdom after the Revolution of 1848. After this, his Prime Minister, Count Cavour, took the initiative of uniting Italy under the leadership of Sardinia. Cavour's policy in some ways was similar to that followed by Bismarck in Germany. Hoping to gain the support of Britain and France, he entered the Crimean War in 1853-56 against Russia, even though Sardinia had no dispute with Russia. However, nothing came out of this war. In 1859, Cavour entered into an alliance with Louis Bonaparte and went to war with Austria. Although France soon withdrew from the war, Austria was ousted from Lombardy, which was taken over by Sardinia. Tuscany, Modena, Parma and the Papal States of the north also joined Sardinia. Venetia, however, was still under Austrian occupation. The other states that remained to be united with Sardinia were the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and Rome, which was under the rule of the Pope. An uprising had broken out in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Garibaldi marched into the island of Sicily with his revolutionary fighters and liberated it from the rule of the king within 3 months. He marched to Naples in support of the revolt that had already broken out there. Italian revolutionaries were not perhaps strong enough to push the victory of the people in the Sicilies further with a view to establishing a united Republic of Italy. Surrendered the former kingdom to the King of Sardinia, Victor Emmanuel II, who then took the title of King of Italy in 1861. Rome was still outside the Kingdom of Italy. It was ruled over by the Pope with the help of the French soldiers provided to him by Louis Bonaparte. When the war between France and Prussia broke out in 1870, Bonaparte was forced to withdraw his troops from Rome. Italian soldiers occupied Rome and it became capital of Italy in 1871. Aftermath. Unification of Germany and Italy. In spite of the fact that democracy was not completely victorious there, marked a great advance in the history of the two countries. One of the aspects of the movements described so far is the gradual growth of political democracy, that is, the ever-increasing participation of increasing number of people in the political life of a country. New political and economic system that was emerging in Europe in 19th century was also creating imperialism. The period of the triumph of democracy and in Europe was also the period of the conquest of Asia and Africa by the imperialist powers of Europe. The 19th century saw the beginning of the revolts against imperialism in Asia and Africa. Socialism. Workers gradually began to organize themselves into trade unions to protect their common rights, though for a long time there were laws against workers combining themselves into unions. The governments were also forced to pass laws against some of the worst features of capitalism. For example, laws to protect workers from unsafe conditions of work were passed in many countries. Some progress was also made in regulating hours of work. Some workers had begun to think that machines were the cause of their misery. In England, there was a movement against machines led the Luddites. In England, Chartist movement was started which aimed at winning political rights for workers. Early socialists. The idea grew that capitalism itself is evil and that it needs to be replaced by a different kind, an economic system in which the means of production would be owned by the society as a whole and not by a few individuals. Many philosophers and reformers in the past had expressed their revulsion against inequalities in society and in favor of a system in which everyone would be equal. French Revolution did not usher in an era of equality in economic, social, and political life. The gap between the aims of the French Revolution and the actual conditions in France after the Revolution created serious discontent among the people. It led to an attempt to overthrow the existing government in France with a view to building a society based on socialist ideas. Babeuf conspiracy organized a secret society called the Society of the Equals. Babeuf, in a manifesto, had declared, "Nature gave everyone an equal right to the enjoyment of all goods. In a true society, there is no room for either rich or poor." The society planned an uprising, but the government came to know of the plan, and in 1796, a large number of leaders including Babeuf were arrested. Babeuf was executed in 1797. Though Babeuf's attempt at overthrowing the government had failed, his ideas exercised an important influence on the growth of socialist movement. Utopian socialists viewed property in relation to its usefulness to the society, recognized the evils of capitalism, and proposed the establishment of a new and better system of society in its place. They visualized a society free from exploitation of any kind and one in which all would contribute their best and would share the fruits of their labor. However, the methods they advocated for the establishment of such a society were impracticable and ineffective. Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier and Robert Owen were associated with this school of thought. Those who helped in spreading ideas of early socialism. Auguste Blanqui, 1805–81, who played a leading role in every uprising in Paris from the 1830s to 1871. Believed that through a revolutionary conspiracy, power could be captured to bring about socialism. Communist League. Many groups formed to spread socialist ideas and organize workers. One of these was the League of the Just, which had members in many countries of Europe. The slogan was "All men are brothers." Thus, internationalism was one of its important features. In 1847, its name was changed to the Communist League, and it declared as its aim the downfall of the bourgeoisie, the rule of the proletariat, the overthrow of the old society of middle class, based on class distinction, and the establishment of a new society without classes and without private property. Its journal carried the slogan, "Proletarians of all lands, unite." It instructed Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to draft a manifesto. The Communist Manifesto first appeared in German in February 1848. The influence of this in history of socialist movement is unparalleled. It was the work of Karl Marx and his lifelong associate Friedrich Engels. Through their work in the socialist movement and through their numerous writings, they gave a new direction to socialist ideology and movement. Their philosophy is known as Marxism, and it has influenced almost every field of knowledge. Their view of socialism is called scientific socialism. The Communist Manifesto stated that the aim of workers all over the world was the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of socialism. In place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class differences, it said appears an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Marxian beliefs. Marx analyzed the working of capitalism in his famous work Das Kapital and pointed out the characteristics that would lead to its destruction. Workers produce more value than they get in the form of wages, the difference being appropriated by the capitalists in the form of profits. This constitutes the basis of conflict in capitalist society. Profits can be increased at the cost of workers' wages and, therefore, the interests of workers and capitalists are irreconcilable. Economic crises were inevitable under capitalism because of the discrepancy between the purchasing power of workers and total production. These crises would be resolved only if the private ownership of the means of production is abolished and the profit motive eliminated from the system of production. Exploiting classes would disappear, and a classless society would emerge in which there would be no difference between what was good for the individual and for society as a whole. Marx and Engels believed that this would be accomplished by the working class, which was the most revolutionary class in capitalist society. They advocated that the emancipation of the working class would emancipate the whole human race from all traces of social injustice. Socialism in the 1840s was a term without a consensus definition, meaning different things to different people, but was typically used within a context of more power for workers in a system based on worker ownership of the means of production. After 1848, with the failure of the 1848 revolutions, the socialist movement seems to have abated. However, it was soon to rise in strength again, due to the internationalist character of various socialist groups. In Britain, Society of Fraternal Democrats had been formed in 1846. It had close links with other similar organizations in Europe and with the Chartists in Britain. All these organizations emphasized the idea that the cause of the working class in all countries was the same. First International. One of the most important events in the history of the socialist movement was the movement was the formation in 1864 of the International Working Men's Association, or the First International. With its formation, socialism stepped on the stage of history as a world movement. The first meeting took place in London and was attended by delegates from all over Europe. Marx drafted the inaugural address which outlined the principles and aims of the International. Emancipation of the working classes must be won by the working classes themselves. The central aim of the International was declared to be the total abolition of all class rule. International was considered by the governments of the time as a menace, and attempts were made to exterminate it. It was persecuted and declared illegal in many countries. During the short period of its existence, the International exercised a tremendous influence on workers' movements in Europe and North America. It played a particularly important role in creating bonds of international solidarity by arranging aid from workers of many countries in support of the workers' struggle in any particular country. One of the finest examples of workers' solidarity was evidenced at the time of the war between Prussia and France in 1870. Workers' groups across the kingdom sent messages of good wishes and solidarity to each other. It collapsed as a result of internal differences. The International was not a homogeneous organization. It represented many different trends in the workers' movement. Due to differences on aims and methods, it was split in 1872 and was formally dissolved in 1876. Paris Commune 1871. War between France and Prussia led to another important development, an uprising by the workers of Paris and the seizure of power by them. This is one of the most important events in the history of socialism. Within a few weeks of the war, the French army had been defeated and the French Emperor Louis Bonaparte had been taken prisoner. A new government had come into being and had declared France a republic. This government was dominated by the propertied classes and had agreed to Bismarck's terms for truce, including the surrender of Paris, cession of Alsace-Lorraine, and the payment of a huge war indemnity. The workers of Paris regarded the surrender by the government as treacherous. They refused to surrender. The government withdrew from Paris in February 1871 and asked for German help to crush Paris. Workers of Paris elected a council in March 1871, assumed the title of the Paris Commune. It was elected by universal adult franchise and represented the workers and the lower middle classes of Paris. It proclaimed as its aim the ending of exploitation, stock exchange speculation, monopolies and privileges to which the proletariat attributes its slavery, and the fatherland its misery and ruin. All public offices were elected by universal suffrage, with people having the right to recall. Paris Commune was the result of an upsurge in which the workers had played the dominant role, the result of the first workers' revolution in history. It was soon drowned in blood. The French government, which had established its headquarters in Versailles, attacked Paris with a huge army with help of Germans. Paris Commune was exterminated. Second International. The 1870s and 80s socialist parties were formed across Europe, with some having lakhs of members. Participated in national elections and in some countries came to have a fairly large representation in the parliament. Similarly, the strength and membership of the trade unions also increased and there were many strikes. To unite the socialist parties in various countries into an international organization, a congress was held in Paris on 14th July 1889, the centenary of the French Revolution of 1789. The result of this was Second International. This was a new stage in the history of socialism. Important step taken at the Congress was to make the 1st May every year as a day of working class solidarity. It was decided to organize on that day a great international demonstration in such a way that all lands and cities will simultaneously demand from the powers that be a limitation the working day to 8 hours. On the 1st May 1890, millions of workers all over Europe and America held strikes and massive demonstrations. Beginning of International Labour Day. After the formation of the Second International saw a steady increase in the strength of the socialist parties and of trade unions. They had become a major force across Europe. Second International and War. Most significant achievements were its campaign against militarism and war and in asserting the principle of basic equality of all peoples and their right to freedom and national independence. The last decade of 19th century saw increased militarization. Europe was getting divided into groups of warring blocs, the struggle for colonies being the main cause of conflicts between them. Struggle against militarism and the prevention of war became the major aims of the Second International and of the socialist parties affiliated to it. Expressed the conviction that capitalism was the root cause of war. Also decided that the socialists should utilize the economic and political crisis created by the war to rouse the masses and thereby to hasten the downfall of capitalist rule. They suffered at the hands of their governments who were preparing for war. Second International also condemned colonialism and committed the socialist parties to oppose the robbery and subjugation of colonial peoples. 1904 Congress was attended by Dadabhai Naoroji, who pleaded the cause of India's freedom. He was supported by the British delegates at the Congress. Limitation of Second International. It was a loose federation of socialist parties of many countries. While the socialist parties in many countries had become mass parties, basic differences had arisen among them. While some sections believed in the necessity of a revolution to overthrow capitalism, others began to believe that socialism could be achieved through gradual reforms. The latter were willing to support the existing governments in certain circumstances. Some sections in the socialist parties even favored colonialism. On the question of war, while the attitude of the Second International was clear, many socialist parties had serious differences. It was the question of the war that the Second International suffered a fatal blow. When WW1 broke out, most of the socialist parties extended their support to their respective governments. This had serious consequences for the socialist movement. The Second International ceased to function and the socialist movement in every country was split. Imperialism. Imperialism is practice of extending power, control or rule by country over political and economic life of areas outside its own borders. This may be done through military or other means, particularly through colonialism. Colonialism in practice of acquiring colonies by conquest or other means and making them dependent on imperialist country. Occupation of or direct rule over a country or people by another country is not always an essential feature of imperialism. Essential feature is exploitation, with or without direct political control. While most countries which came under direct imperialist rule are now politically independent, economic exploitation has not ended. This has been termed as neocolonialism. First phase of the imperialist control and colonization of Asia, Africa and the Americas. First phase of Americas began in 16th century. Voyages of discovery were followed by the founding of vast colonial empires by Portugal, Spain, Holland, England and France in the Americas. Spain occupied most of South America, excluding Brazil, which was occupied by Portugal, Central America, Mexico, West Indies, and parts of what is now the United States of America. England and France occupied parts of North America. Many people from these countries of Europe went to settle in these colonies permanently. During this period, the European control in Africa extended only to about 20% of continent, mainly in the coastal areas. European slave traders enslaved and transported about 5,000 Africans to the Americas every month during the 17th century to overcome the shortage of manual labor in the New World. Asia, the Europeans came mainly with the purpose of trade. Trading companies from Portugal, Holland, England, France and other countries, with the backing of their respective monarchs, set up their trading posts and tried to establish their monopoly of trade with the countries of Asia, and each tried to exclude the others through war and by extending their political influence and control. Portuguese who controlled the trade with Asia were ousted from that position by the Dutch, Indonesia, and the English, India, who extended their control. Period BW 16th to 17th century was naked plunder by colonial powers led to growth of capitalism and industrial revolution. New phase of imperialism began in 1875 as pursuit of colonies re-emerged as a result of economic and political system that developed along with industrial revolution, as European kingdoms were unified as nation-states. Forms of control and domination including direct colonial rule, spheres of influence, and various types of economic and commercial agreements. Of Spain and Portugal declined and Britain and France continued to expand. Germany, Italy, Belgium, USA and later Japan had joined the race. Conditions that led to growth of imperialism. More powerful nations made imperialism seem necessary and natural. Demands created by Industrial Revolution resulted in a great increase in the production of goods and created capitalist system of production. Production of goods was far in excess of the demand at home, and low wages meant low purchasing power of majority. European countries could find markets for their surplus goods in Asia and Africa where the Industrial Revolution had not taken place. Selling was made easier through political domination. In addition to markets, European countries needed new sources of raw materials. As industries grew, more and more raw materials were needed to feed those industries. India and Egypt were good sources of cotton, Congo and the East Indies, of rubber, and other products needed were food grains, tea, coffee, indigo, tobacco and sugar. Abundance of raw materials in Asia and Africa, and the number of people who could be made to work for lower wages made the two continents very attractive to investors. From about the end of the 19th century, export of capital for investment in other countries began to become more important than the export of goods. However, investments were not safe without political domination. Improvement in transportation and communication changes in transport and communication made spread of imperialism easier. Steamships could carry goods much faster. Railroads and inland waterways were built for transport of raw materials and finished products. Extreme nationalism from mid-19th century onwards, there was a period of intense nationalism. Many nations developed myths of their superiority over other peoples. Writers and speakers in England, France and Germany opened institutions to promote the idea of imperialism, and took great pride in calling their territories empires. Imperialist countries took over some places in Asia and Africa because of their military or strategic importance. England needed Port Said, Aden, Hong Kong, Singapore and Cyprus, not to protect England but to protect her conquered lands and trade route to India from rival nations. Civilizing mission in minds of many Europeans, imperialist expansion was very noble. They considered it a way of bringing civilization to the backward peoples of the world. Rudyard Kipling asked his countrymen to shoulder what he called the white man's burden. Christian missionaries also played their part in promoting the idea of imperialism. Explorers and adventurers helped in spreading imperialism. They went into unknown or little-known territories and brought back reports that often indicated opportunities for trade and development. Most important condition favoring the imperialist conquest of Asia and Africa was that the Industrial Revolution had not come to this part of the world. Production was still on a small scale, and lack of industrial knowledge also put militaries of these lands at a disadvantage. Government of countries in Asia and Africa were weak after breakup of empires of Middle Ages. People's loyalties were still to local princes, as in feudal times, or to tribal chieftains, who cared little for the welfare of the people. Conquest of Asia. British in India. Decline of the Mughal Empire in India gave the British and the French, who had come to trade, an opportunity to conquer India. After the revolt of 1857, the British government took over direct control of India. Many princely states survived, but they were free only in name. Conflict between the English and French was over establishing a monopoly of trade. After the English dominance, fortunes were made by the officers of the company. India was known as the brightest jewel of the British Empire. Millions of pounds were drained out of India to England in the form of profits and as payment to the British government as direct tribute and home charges. 1883, all import and export duties were waived. Indian resources, both human and material, were used to promote the interests of British imperialism in China, Central Asia and Africa. China imperialist domination began with what are known as the Opium Wars, 1839-42 and 1856-60. Before these wars, only 2 ports were open to foreign traders. British merchants bought Chinese tea, silk and other goods, but there was no market for British goods in China. Then British merchants started smuggling opium into China on a large scale. The illegal opium trade was profitable to the British traders but did immense physical and moral damage to the Chinese. 1839, when a Chinese government official seized an opium cargo and destroyed it, Britain declared war and easily defeated the Chinese. Chinese were then forced to pay heavy damages to the British and to open 5 port cities to British traders. British subjects in these ports would be tried for any crimes in English rather than in Chinese courts, extraterritorial rights. The Chinese government was no longer free to impose tariff on foreign goods. The island of Hong Kong was turned over to Britain. Soon France entered into similar unequal treaties with China. On the pretext that a French missionary had been murdered, England and France fought another war with China. China was defeated and was forced to grant more privileges to her conquerors. Japanese entered China to increase their influence over Korea, which was under Chinese overlordship. After war with Japan in 1894–95, China was forced to grant independence to Korea and cede Formosa, Taiwan, to Japanese. Also paid $150 million in war damages. France, Russia, Britain and Germany gave loans to China to help her to meet this payment. They divided China into spheres of influence. Germany got Kyoto Bay and exclusive rights in Shandong and Huanghe Valley. Russia took Liaoning Peninsula, along with the right to build railroads in Manchuria. France received Guangzhou Bay and extensive rights in 3 southern provinces of China. Britain got Veheve in addition to her sphere of influence in the Hong Kong. China, spheres of influence and treaty ports, Lake Balkhash Usia India Bay of Bengal 1000 miles Luke Bakal Mongolia CTLLN 4 circa 1900 Anchuri Sea of Oe Japan Eling Diangazha Yellow Sea Anghai Ingbo Fuzhu Taiwan Rango Ban KCM FR NCH 2000 km Geography Skill Builder, Interpreting Maps 1. Human-environment interaction. Which countries had spheres of influence in China? 2. Location. What foreign power shown on the map had access to inland China? What geographic feature made this possible? Hina Manil South China Sea IP. U.S. Pacific Ocean spheres of influence. British, French, German, Japanese, Russian treaty ports. Original port opened by Treaty of Nanjing, 1842. Or treaty port opened by 1900. Major city. Open door policy. United States feared that China would be completely parceled out in exclusive spheres of influence and that its trade with China would be shut off. All countries would have equal rights to trade anywhere in China. Britain supported the United States, thinking that this policy would discourage the annexation of China by Japan and Russia. Scramble for privileges stopped in China after an uprising against the foreign powers known as the Boxer Rebellion, 1899–1901. Background: severe drought and disruption caused by the growth of foreign spheres of influence, but the foreign powers were victorious and levied heavy damages on China as punishment. Imperialism continued, with the cooperation of Chinese warlords, Beiyang cliques. These military commanders were supported by the loans which they got from foreign powers in exchange for more privileges. Southeast Asia. Even before the rise of the new imperialism, many of these countries were already dominated by the Europeans. Indochina consists of Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam. When England was fighting China over the opium trade, France was trying to extend her commerce in Indochina. Series of planned steps which included threats of war, France became the master of Indochina, and the separate states were grouped together under a French governor-general. Burma. In 1880, the King of Burma gave France the right to build a railway from Tonkin to Mandalay. British government, fearing French expansion, started a war with Burma. Burmese king was captured and sent to India. Burma was annexed and became a part of Britain's empire in India in 1886. Philippines. United States occupied it in 1898 after Spanish-American War. Main issue was Cuban independence, revolt of the Cubans in the Caribbean against Spanish rule. There was a revolt of the Filipinos against Spanish rule, and the United States occupied Cuba and the Philippines. The Filipinos revolted against the American occupation but were suppressed, and the Philippines became an American possession. Central and West Asia. England and Russia were rivals in the struggle to control Central Asia, Iran, Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet. Russian Empire succeeded in annexing almost all of Central Asia in the second half of 19th century. Conflict between England and Russia came to a head over Iran and Afghanistan. However, England was more keen on defending India. Russia agreed to recognize Afghanistan as being outside her influence, and Britain agreed not to annex Afghanistan as long as her ruler remained loyal to her. North Iran was Russian sphere of influence, south was for British, and central was kept neutral. However, after 1917, Russia withdrew. Iran remained nominally independent, but was increasingly under the domination of foreign oil companies, Standard Oil Company of the United States and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company of England. 1907, both agreed not to interfere in Tibet. Germany, during these years, was extending her influence over Turkey and the Asian possessions of the Turkish Empire. A railroad from Istanbul to Baghdad was planned. Through this, Germany hoped to promote her economic interests in this region and on to Iran and India. France, England and Russia opposed this, but an agreement to divide the region was reached between Germany, France and England. First World War, however, changed the situation. Oil and the concessions to control oil resources became the major objectives of the imperialist countries in Western Asia. American oil companies, in partnership with England and France, got oil concessions in Arabia. Japan as imperialist power started in 1890s. In 1867, after a change in government, known as Meiji Restoration, Japan began to modernize her economy. Within a few decades, she became one of the most industrialized countries of the world. But the forces that made many of the Western countries imperialist were also active in the case of Japan. Japan had few raw materials to support her industries. So she looked for lands that had them and for markets to sell her manufactured goods. War between China and Japan over Korea in 1894. After this, Japan's influence in China increased. Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902 recognized her as a power of equal standing with the great European powers. In 1904-05 she defeated Russia. As a result of this war, the southern half of Sakhalin was ceded to Japan. Japan also gained control of the southern part of the Liaoning Peninsula with Port Arthur, which was leased to her. In 1910, Korea became a colony of Japan. Imperialism in Africa. From the time of European explorations from mid-15th century, a new phase began in the history of some parts of Africa. Slave trade. European penetration of Africa was confined for a long time mainly to certain coastal areas. However, even these limited contacts led to the most tragic and disastrous consequences for the people of Africa. One of the first results of these contacts was the purchase and sale of people, the slave trade. Spanish rule in the Americas had resulted in the large-scale extermination of the original inhabitants of the Americas. Portuguese had established a slave market in Lisbon, started slave trade, and the Spaniards bought slaves from there and took them to their colonies in the Americas to work there. African villages were raided by slave traders and people were captured and handed over to the European traders. Earlier, the Arabs had dominated the slave trade. Subsequently, some African chiefs also took part in the slave trade by trading slaves in exchange for firearms, which the European traders sold to them. Europeans themselves also raided the villages and enslaved the people, who were then transported. When the demand for slaves in America increased, they were sent directly from Africa by the traders. Millions of Africans were uprooted from their homes. Many were killed while resisting the raids on their villages by the traders. It is estimated that not even half of the slaves captured reached America alive. Inhuman conditions under which they were forced to work on the plantations cannot even be imagined today. Extreme brutalities were inflicted on those who tried to escape. Slavery had become an integral part of the colonial system. Slavery was also a hindrance if the interior of Africa was to be open to colonial exploitation. Some colonial powers used the pretext of abolishing slave trade to go to war against African chiefs and kings to expand their territorial possessions. Scramble for Africa. Interior of Africa was almost unknown to the Europeans up to mid-19th century. Coastal regions were largely in the hands of the old trading nations Portuguese, the Dutch, the English and the French. In the north the French had conquered Algeria. South the English had occupied Cape Colony to safeguard their commerce with India. It had earlier been a Dutch colony. These settlers, known as Boers, had taken to farming. Explorers, traders and missionaries played their respective roles in the conquest of Africa. The explorers aroused the Europeans' interest in Africa. Missionaries saw the continent as a place for spreading the message of Christianity. The interests created by explorers and missionaries were soon used by the traders. Even though the European powers met with stiff resistance from the Africans and it took them a long time to establish effective occupation of their colonies, the speed with which the European powers conquered Africa is without a parallel. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. Africa was also not divided into United Nation states but into warring factions, who often sought European support against their rivals. Against this, the imperialist countries participating in the scramble for Africa were united. The scramble to grab the maximum of African territory in the shortest possible time was the result of these rivalries. Many a time during the scramble, wars between these countries were imminent. But in every case, war was avoided and agreements reached between them as to who will get which part of Africa. Madeira is Tangier, Port Canary Jays, Times Casablanca Morocco Algiers Mediterranean Sea Libya Irene Algeria Rio de o French West Africa Cairo Times Egypt Ambia Port Voici, Ulan Atlantic Ocean Africa after the scramble 1914 British El Chad Khartoum Anglo-Egyptian Sudan Fashoda Times Nigeria Cameroons Rio Belgian Congo Angola French as Rhodesia. In 1884 to 85, there was a congress in Berlin where a group of European states met and discussed how to carve out Africa among themselves. No African state was represented at this congress. Treaties were signed between European powers to settle disputes over claims to African territories between themselves. Treaties were also signed between African rulers and chiefs, and the representatives of European governments or European companies. A look at the map of Africa after partition will show how the continent of Africa was partitioned on paper in conference rooms in Europe, paper partition. About 30% of all boundaries in Africa are in straight lines. Belgium in 1878, with the financial assistance of King Leopold II of Belgium, H.M. Stanley founded the International Congo Association, which made over 400 treaties with African chiefs who didn't know they were transferring their land to the Congo Association in exchange for cloth or other articles of no great value. Stanley acquired large tracts of land by these methods. In 1885 some 2.3 million sq km, rich in rubber and ivory, became the Congo Free State with Leopold as its king. However, treatment of the Congolese people was so bad that even other colonial powers were shocked. In 1908, Leopold was compelled to hand over the Congo Free State to the Belgian government, and it became known as Belgian Congo. Gradually, Congo's gold, diamond, uranium, timber and copper became more important than her rubber and ivory. More countries joined the exploitation. Frenchman, de Brazza, was active north of the Congo River. Following the methods of Stanley, de Brazza won the area for France. This area became what was until recently called the French Congo, with its capital town named Brazzaville. More territories were added to the West African conquests after 1900 and French West Africa came to include present Senegal, French Guinea, the Ivory Coast, Dahomey, Mauritania, French Sudan, Upper Volta and Niger Territory. French conquest resulted in brutal exploitation of the people everywhere in Africa. Germany after 1880, Germany also got very interested in possessions in Africa. First occupied an area called Togoland on the west coast, soon after, the Cameroons, a little farther south. Still farther south, the Germans established themselves in southwest Africa, Namibia, where, to suppress local rebels, more than half of the population was exterminated. With the exception of Liberia, the whole of West Africa was divided up among the Europeans. Liberia was settled by slaves who had been freed in America. Rhodesia English adventurer, Cecil Rhodes, came to South Africa in 1870. Made a fortune in mining diamond and gold of this region and gave his name to an African colony Rhodesia, present Zambia and Zimbabwe. British occupied Bechuanaland, Rhodesia, Swaziland and Basutoland. plotted the overthrow of the Boer government of Transvaal, which was rich in gold. This led to the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, in which the Boers were defeated though they continued to remain there. Soon after this, the Union of South Africa was formed, consisting of the Cape, Natal, Transvaal, and Orange River Colony. Ruled by white minority, Boers, Englishmen, and other European countries. East Africa, except for the Portuguese possession of a part of Mozambique, East Africa had not been occupied by any European power before 1884. Using bribery and threats, Karl Peters persuaded some rulers to sign agreements placing themselves under German protection. Since France and Britain also had plans in this area, an agreement was signed by which France got Madagascar, and East Africa was divided between Germany, Tanzania, and England, Kenya. After WW1, Tanzania went to England, Rwanda, Burundi to Belgium. Italy entered the colonial race late. Italians occupied two desert areas in Horn of Africa, Somaliland, and Eritrea. Abyssinia, now known as Ethiopia, was an independent state, and Italy wanted to declare it as its protectorate and invaded her. They were defeated in 1896. Ethiopia was also never colonized, though occupied by Italians before WW2. North Africa, Algeria was conquered by France in 1830. It was the most profitable of France's colonial possessions, providing her a vast market for French goods. Tunisia was coveted by France, England, and Italy. According to an agreement in 1878, England gave France a free hand in Tunisia in return for British occupation of the island of Cyprus. Morocco, both France and Italy wanted to claim it as their territory. Agreed, in 1900, to the French occupation of Morocco and to the Italian occupation of Tripoli and Cyrenaica, renamed Libya. In 1904, France and England signed an agreement which gave Morocco to France and Egypt to England. Spain had been promised Tangier in return for French occupation of Morocco. So it became necessary to appease German ambition in North Africa by giving parts of French Congo. Egypt was a province of the Turkish Empire. A French company had gained a concession from Ismail Pasha, governor of Egypt, to dig a canal across the Isthmus of Suez. The canal was completed in 1869 and aroused British interest in the area. Financial troubles of the Pasha led to increased joint Anglo-French control over Egypt. When the Pasha tried to resist, he was forced to abdicate, and a new governor was appointed. In 1882, there was a revolt against the Anglo-French control and, in suppressing the revolt, the British armies conquered Egypt. In 1922, though she still retained her rights over the Suez and many other concessions, Britain was forced to recognize Egypt as an independent sovereign state. Americas and Pacific by 1820 as almost all countries of the Americas had gained their independence from Spain and Portugal. Only a few colonies ruled by European countries were left in this part of the world. Among these were Cuba and Puerto Rico, which was still under Spanish rule, and a few others under British, French, Dutch and Danish rule. The United States in 19th century emerged as the biggest power in the Americas. extended territories through war with Mexico and purchase of Louisiana, France, Florida, Spain, and Alaska, Russia. Within a short period after the Civil War, 1861–65, which ended in the abolition of slavery, the United States emerged as a major industrial and military power in the world. In 1900, her naval strength was third in the world. Forces that had led to the emergence of imperialism in Europe and later in Japan also led to the emergence of the United States as a major imperialist power. After the American-Spanish War, the Philippines had become a U.S. colony. The USA had also taken Puerto Rico and Guam from Spain, and Cuba, independent in name. Monroe Doctrine USA spread its control over South America and the Pacific. 1823, Monroe made 4 basic points. USA will not interfere in the internal affairs of or the wars between European powers. Recognized and would not interfere with existing colonies and dependencies in the Western Hemisphere. Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization, and any attempt by a European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. In 1904, Britain and Germany had imposed a naval blockade of Venezuela as she had failed to repay the loan which she had taken from them. Roosevelt forced Britain and Germany to lift the blockade and declared that the United States alone had the right to intervene in the affairs of her neighboring countries if they were unable to maintain order on their own. Took control of the finances of Dominican Republic, which she retained for 3 decades, and occupied that country in 1916 for 8 years. In 1906, American troops were sent to Cuba and remained there for 3 years to protect Cuba from disorder. In Mexico, where the United States had huge investments, Francisco Madero, a popular leader, was deposed with the support of the United States. The intervention by the United States in Mexico continued for many years. Dollar diplomacy policy of the United States was described as the big stick policy and one of an international policeman. The extension of the USA influence through economic investments in the region is known as the dollar diplomacy. Economic and political domination of South America was facilitated by the absence of strong governments in the countries of South America. Many of these countries were ruled by corrupt military leaders with armed gangs. They floated loans for ready cash and sold concessions to foreign companies to exploit the natural resources of their countries. They served as markets for manufacturers and sources of raw materials for industrialized countries, particularly the United States, as well as avenues for investment of capital from these countries. Panama Canal. A French company had started the construction of the canal in the Isthmus of Panama in Colombia. Canal, which would link the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, was of great economic interest. In 1901, the United States decided to undertake the canal project alone. Paid $40 million to the French company and entered into an agreement with the government of Colombia. $10 million plus $250,000 annual rent, which was against interests of Colombians and who refused to ratify the deal. In 1903, USA financed and organized a revolt in Panama and landed her troops there. USA recognized Panama as an independent state and new government granted 10-mile canal zone. Canal was opened in 1914 and was passed on to Panama in 1999. Hawaii Islands of Hawaii had been important for American shipping and for trade with China. USA's economic and commercial influence gradually increased in these islands and with the settling of Americans there, particularly as sugar planters. USA secured the exclusive use of Pearl Harbor as a naval station. 1893, the American residents in the Hawaii Islands revolted against the Queen of Hawaii and asked for the annexation of the islands by the United States, which was done by 1898. Effects of imperialism. Economic backwardness. Industrialization of these countries was prevented. Where industries were started, these were subordinated to the interests of the industries of the imperialist countries or for making profits for the companies of the imperialist countries. Naked plunder of natural resources and exploitation through high demands of revenues and taxes. Racism. Imperialism also bred racial arrogance and discrimination. The idea of the superiority of the white race whom God had created to govern the world was popularized in the imperialist countries. Japanese were called honorary whites. Getting possession of new markets and raw materials and establishing industries to be worked by cheap labor created many small wars and two-world conflicts. Despite the gentlemen's agreements, there was a continuous effort among the West distant powers to redivide the world as between themselves, but never with any consideration for the welfare of the people to whom the territory really belonged. WW1. In the earlier wars, the civilian populations were not generally involved and the casualties were generally confined to the warring armies. The war which began in 1914 was a total war in which all the resources of the warring states were mobilized. It affected the economy of the entire world. The casualties suffered by the civilian population from bombing of the civilian areas and the famines and epidemics caused by the war far exceeded those suffered by the armies. In its impact also, the war had no precedent. Marked a turning point in world history. The battles of the war were fought in Europe, Asia, Africa and the Pacific. Because of the unprecedented extent of its spread and its total nature, it is known as the First World War. Underlying causes of the war were the rivalries and conflicts among the imperialist countries. In short, alliances, imperialism, militarism, nationalism, and finally the assassination. Wars were generally avoided at that time because the possibilities of further conquest were still there. By end of 19th century, however, the situation had changed. Further conquests could take place only by dispossessing some imperialist country of its colonies. Germany entered the scramble for colonies late. After the unification of Germany had been achieved, it made tremendous economic progress. By 1914, it had left Britain and France far behind in the production of iron and steel and in many manufactures. It had entered the shipping trade in a big way and was expanding its navy at a great pace, much to the discomfort of Britain and France. Japan, which had also become an imperialist power, had ambitions in the Far East and was on way to fulfilling them. She defeated Russia in 1904-05 after having signed an agreement with Britain and was able to extend her influence in the Far East. The rise of any other country was considered a danger to the British Empire. She also had her vast international trade to defend against the competition from other countries. Conflicts within Europe's six major powers in Europe at this time: Britain, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, France and Italy. Almost all these countries got involved concerned the countries comprising the Balkan Peninsula in Europe. The Balkan question. Balkan countries had been under the rule of Ottoman Turks. However, in 19th century, Ottoman rule had begun to collapse. There were revolts by various nationalities for independence. Russian Tsars hoped that these areas would come under their control once the Ottomans were ousted from there. They encouraged a movement called the Pan-Slav movement, which was based on the theory that all the Slavs of Eastern Europe were one people. Major Balkan country, Serbia, led the movement for uniting the areas inhabited by the Slavs in the Ottoman Empire as well as in Austria-Hungary. Serbian nationalism was encouraged by Russia, which alarmed other European powers. Corresponding to the Pan-Slav movement, there was a Pan-German movement which aimed at the expansion of Germany all over Central Europe and in the Balkans. He claimed certain areas which were under Austrian rule. France hoped to recover not only Alsace-Lorraine, which she had lost to Germany in 1871, but also to wreak vengeance on Germany. Alliances. Because of these conflicts over imperialism and nationalism, European countries began to form themselves into opposing groups. Europe was gradually becoming a vast armed camp due to military build-up. Simultaneously, propaganda for war, to breed hatred against other countries, to paint one's own country as superior to others, and to glorify war, was started in each country. Triple Alliance was formed in 1882 comprising Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. However, Italy's loyalty to this alliance was uncertain, as her main aim was to gain territories in Europe from Austria-Hungary, and in conquering Tripoli with French support. Triple Entente emerged opposed to alliance, comprising France, Russia and Britain in 1907. In theory it was only a loose group based on mutual understanding, as the word Entente. RWD GVK Anit Kingdom Nathe NIUWC Den Germany Berg Austria France Schweizer Mo joined IS. Events before the war. Outbreak of the war was preceded by a series of incidents which added to the prevailing tension and ultimately led to the war. Clash over Morocco. In 1904, Britain and France had entered into a secret agreement according to which Britain was to have a free hand in Egypt, and France was to take over Morocco. The agreement became known to Germany and aroused her indignation. Germany promised support for full independence to Morocco, First Moroccan Crisis. In 1911, however, was averted, and Germany was made to appease with a part of French Congo, following Agadir Crisis, Second. This was a setback to German Weltpolitik, foreign policy from 1890s onward. Realpolitik was defensive policy Bismarck era. Balkans. In 1908, Austria annexed the Ottoman provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina. These provinces were also coveted by Serbia, which had the backing of Russia in establishing a united Slav state in the Balkans. Russia threatened to start a war against Austrian annexation, but annexation, but Germany's open support to Austria compelled Russia to retreat. Incident, however, not only embittered feelings in Serbia, but also created further enmity between Russia and Germany. First Balkan War, 1912. Serbia, Greece, Montenegro and Bulgaria launched series of attacks on Turkey and captured most of the remaining Turkish territory of Europe. Serbs weren't happy with the resulting settlement. Albania was given independence, which Serbs wanted to have an outlet to the sea, as per a deliberate move by Austria. Second Balkan War, 1913. Bulgarians weren't happy with settlement either, and they blamed Serbia. Greece, Romania, Turkey rallied to support Serbia when Bulgaria attacked, and were made to forfeit their gains from First War. Anglo-German influence prevented escalation of war by restraining the Austrians, who wanted to attack Serbs. Consequences: Serbia strengthened and determined to take Bosnia. Austria equally determined to end Serbia's ambitions. Finally, the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. On 28 June 1914, heir to the Emperor Franz Joseph of Habsburg Empire, Franz Ferdinand was shot dead by Serb terrorist Gavrilo Princip. Austrians blamed Serbian government and sent a harsh ultimatum. Serbs accepted most of the demands, but the Austrians, with the promise of German support, used this as an excuse to declare war on Serbia. Russia, determined to not let Serbs down again, ordered a general mobilization of the army. Germany asked them to back down, but when they didn't comply, declared war on Russia, 1st August, and on France, 3rd August. Germany entered Belgium to invade France. Britain enters war next day, 4th August. Austria-Hungary declared war on Russia, 6th August. Italy and Japan joined in later from Allied side in hope of gaining territories from Austria and Germany, in China, respectively. First World War: most expected it to be a short war like other European wars. Germans failed to achieve rapid defeat of France and led to trench warfare for the rest of the war years. East Front had more movement, with early Russian successes against Austrians, who had to be constantly helped out by the Germans. Germany eventually forced Russia out of war by end of December 1917. France and Britain were on verge of defeat, but the entry of USA in April 1917 turned it in favor of the Allies. British naval blockade of German ports and defeating of submarine threats was also telling on Germans. Eventually an armistice was signed on 11 November 1918, though Germany had hardly been invaded. Allies: Italy, May 1915, Romania, August 1916, USA, April 1917, Central Turkey, November 1914, Bulgaria, October 1915. Western Front Schlieffen Plan didn't materialize due to strong pushback by Belgium, and Battle of Marne proved decisive. Hope of short war dashed. Germany has full-scale war on two fronts, trench warfare from coast to Alps, bought British Navy time to bring crippling blockade on Germany. 1916 Battle of Verdun, February to June, heavy casualty and no gains by either sides, and Battle of Somme, July to November, British trying to relieve pressure at Verdun and succeeded in deflating German morale. Both battles are important because they too led heavy loss of lives, criticism of army tactics, change of PM, Asquith Lloyd George. 1917 Mutiny in French military, success of battle tanks, Battle of Cambrai, which became model of Allied attack. Lloyd George and Clemenceau team up and rally the wilting allies. Eastern Front Russians made the mistake of invading Austria and Germany at the same time, however lost to Germany every time they clashed. Russians had the largest standing army but not enough arms and ammunition. Turkey cut their supply route via Black Sea. 1915 British and French tried to help, Gallipoli campaign, unsuccessfully. Bulgaria entered the war and overran Serbia with German help. Italy declared war from Allied side in hope of gaining territory. 1916 Germany took Romania and their oil and wheat supply. 1917 Russian withdrawal due to heavy losses, lack of arms and supplies, problems of transport and communication, and utterly incompetent leadership causing to revolutions. Bolsheviks come into power and willing to make peace. Entire German force shifts to Western Front. British captures Baghdad and Jerusalem, gaining control of vast oil supplies. War at sea. Allied used navy for central power blockades to starve them out, keep their trade routes open and transport troops and supplies. No direct confrontation of dreadnoughts other than Battle of Jutland, 1916, with indecisive results but Germans embarking on unrestricted submarine warfare. This eventually brought USA into war as it was hampering their trade interests and lives of Americans, along with the discovery that Germany was persuading Mexico to attack USA, Zimmermann telegram, and gain territories plus Russian withdrawal from the Allied side. German U-boats sunk British passenger liner as it was carrying vast quantities of weapons, in which some Americans died, forcing American protests, which meant German submarine blockade wasn't as effective. German armistice. Britain, France and USA launched a military offensive in July 1918 and Germany and her allies began to collapse. Bulgaria withdrew from the war in September, and Turkey surrendered in October. Germany went for final offensive before American troops arrived and domestic discontent with war leads to revolution. Almost pulled it off, but French managed to hold off and launched a counter-offensive which forced the Germans to withdraw their entire line, disease plus low morale. Political discontent had been rising in Austria-Hungary and Germany. The Emperor of Austria-Hungary surrendered on 3 November. Germany revolution broke out. Germany became a republic and the German Emperor Kaiser William II fled to Holland. The German government signed an armistice on 11 November 1918 hoping to get less severe terms based on Wilson's 14 points. War was over. Main countries involved in war had war aims which they were determined to achieve, which were competing in nature, and would mean that an accepted negotiable solution will be impossible to reach. Why Central Powers lost? Failure of Schlieffen Plan, naval blockade by Allies, failure of German submarine campaign, also got USA involved, entry of USA and its resources, competent leadership of Lloyd George and Clemenceau versus Central Powers, continuous strain of heavy losses on Germans, and weakness of German allies. January 1918, Woodrow Wilson had proposed a peace program, known as 14 points. These included the conduct of negotiations between states openly, freedom of navigation, reduction of armaments, independence of Belgium, restoration of Alsace-Lorraine to France, creation of independent states in Europe, formation of an international organization to guarantee the independence of all states, etc. Some of these points were accepted when the peace treaties were signed at the end of the war. President Wilson's 14 points. 1. Open diplomacy. 2. Freedom of the seas. 3. Removal of economic barriers. 4. Reduction of armaments. 5. Adjustment of colonial claims. 6. Territories in Russia. 7. Preservation of Belgian sovereignty. 8. Restoration of French territory. 9. Drawing of Italian frontiers. 10. Division of Austria-Hungary. 11. Drawing of Balkan boundaries. 12. Limitations on Turkey. 13. Establishment of an independent Poland. 14. Creation of an association of nations. Treaties. Though the number of countries represented at the conference was 27, the terms of the peace treaties were really decided by 3 countries, Britain, France and USA. 3 persons who played the determining role in framing the terms of the treaties were Woodrow Wilson, USA, Lloyd George, Britain, and George Clemenceau, France. The defeated countries were not represented at the conference. Russia was also excluded. The terms of the treaty were thus not the result of negotiations but were imposed on the defeated by the victors. The Treaty of Versailles' main treaty was signed with Germany on 28 June 1919. Republican government of Germany was compelled to sign this treaty under the threat of invasion. Treaty declared Germany and her allies guilty of aggression. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Perhaps the most humiliating portion of the treaty for the defeated Germany was Article 231, commonly known as the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept complete responsibility for initiating World War I. The coal mines in the German area called Saar were ceded to France for 15 years while that area was to be governed by the League of Nations. Germany also ceded parts of her pre-war territory to Denmark, Belgium, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. The area of the Rhine Valley was to be demilitarized. Also contained provisions for disarming Germany. Strength of her army was to be limited to 100,000 and she was required not to have any air force and submarines. Disposed of all her colonies, which were taken over by the victors. The Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye and Trianon Austria-Hungary was broken up and Austria was required to recognize the independence of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and Poland. To cede territories to them and to Italy. Many changes were made in the Balkans where new states were created and transfers of territories from one state to another took place. The Treaty of Sèvres treaty with Turkey stipulated the complete dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. Britain was given Palestine and Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Syria and Lebanon went to France as what were called mandates. Most of the remaining Turkish territories were to be given to Greece and Italy, and Turkey was to be reduced to a very small state. However, there was a revolution in Turkey under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal. Sultan was deposed and Turkey was proclaimed a republic in 1922. Turkey regained control of Asia Minor and the city of Constantinople, and the Allies were forced to abandon the earlier treaty. League of Nations. An important part of the peace treaties was the Covenant of the League of Nations. Wilson's 14 points included the creation of an international organization for the preservation of peace and to guarantee the independence of all states. The League of Nations was created. It was intended as a world organization of all independent states. It aimed at the preservation of peace and security and peaceful settlement of international conflicts, and bound its members not to resort to war. One of its important provisions was with regard to sanctions. According to this provision, economic and military action would be taken against any country which committed aggression. It also bound its members to improve labor and social conditions in their countries. The International Labour Organization was set up, which is now one of the specialized agencies of the United Nations. Hopes of having a truly world organization devoted to the preservation of peace and independence of nations were, however, not realized with the formation of the League. Major countries, Germany and the Soviet Union, were not allowed to become its members for many years, while India, which was not independent, was made a member. USA, which had played an important part in the setting up of the League, ultimately decided not to join it. The League was never an effective organization. In the 1930s, when many countries resorted to aggression, the League was either ignored or defied. Allies had entered into many secret agreements for dividing the spoils of war. The Soviet government, to bring out the imperialist nature of the war, made these treaties public. During the war, the Allies had been claiming that the war was being fought for freedom and democracy. President Wilson had said that the war was being fought to make the world safe for democracy. The publication of secret treaties by the Soviet government exposed these claims, Sykes-Picot Agreement. However, in spite of this, the distribution of the colonies of the defeated countries among the victors took place. Russian Revolution. Conditions prior. By the early years of 20th century, political movements based on the ideas of socialism had emerged in a number of countries in Europe. With WW1, socialist movement in most countries of Europe suffered a setback. The Second International faced a split on the question of attitude to the war and ceased to function. Russia was still living in the old world under the autocratic rule of the Tsars. Serfdom had been abolished in 1861, but it did not improve the condition of peasants. They still had miserably small holdings of land with no capital to develop even these. For the small holdings they acquired, they had to pay heavy redemption dues for decades. And hunger of the peasants was a major social factor in the Russian society. Industrialization began very late in Russia, in the second half of the 19th century. Then it developed at a fairly fast rate, but more than half of the capital for investment came from foreign countries. Foreign investors were interested in quick profits and showed no concern for the conditions of workers. Russian capitalists, with insufficient capital, competed with foreign investors by reducing workers' wages. Words of Marx that workers have nothing to lose, but their chains rang literally true to them. Russian state under the Tsars was completely unsuited to the needs of modern times. Tsar Nicholas II still believed in the divine right of kings. Preservation of absolutism was regarded by him as a sacred duty. The people who supported the Tsar were the nobility and the upper layers of the clergy. Russian Tsars had built a vast empire by conquest of diverse nationalities in Europe and Asia. In these conquered areas, they imposed the use of the Russian language and tried to belittle the cultures of the people of these areas. Russia's imperialist expansion brought her into conflicts with other imperialist powers. Growth of revolutionary movements. There were many peasant rebellions in Russia before the 19th century, but they were suppressed. Many Russian thinkers had been influenced by developments in Western Europe and wanted to see similar changes in Russia. Their efforts had helped to bring about the abolition of serfdom. This, however, turned out to be a hollow victory. In the last quarter of 19th century, there was a movement known as going to the people when intellectuals started preaching their ideas to the peasants. When the workers' organizations were set up after industrialization began, they were dominated by ideas of socialism. In 1883, the Russian Social Democratic Party was formed by Georgy Plekhanov, a follower of Marx. This party, along with many other socialist groups, was united into the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1898. However, the party was soon split over questions of organization and policy. One group, which was in a minority, hence known as the Mensheviks, favored the party of the type that existed in countries like France and Germany and participated in elections to the parliaments of their countries. The majority, known as the Bolsheviks, were convinced that in a country where no democratic rights existed and where there was no parliament, a party organized on parliamentary lines would not be effective. They favor the party of those who would abide by the discipline of the party and work for revolution. The leader of the Bolsheviks was Vladimir Lenin. He is regarded as one of the greatest leaders of the socialist movement after Marx and Engels. He devoted himself to the task of organizing the Bolshevik Party as an instrument for bringing about revolution. Russian socialists, including Plekhanov and Lenin, had played an important part in the Second International. 1905 revolutionary movement in Russia had been growing when the 1905 revolution broke out. In 1904, a war had broken out between Russia and Japan, which ended in Russian defeat. This had further strengthened the revolutionary movement in Russia. January 1905, a mass of peaceful workers with their wives and children was fired at in St. Petersburg while on its way to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar. More than 1,000 of them were killed and thousands of others were wounded. This day is known as Bloody Sunday. The news of the killings provoked unprecedented disturbances throughout Russia. Sections of the army and the navy revolted. A new form of organization developed in this revolution which proved decisive in the upheaval of 1917. This was the Soviet, or the Council of Workers' Representatives. Beginning as committees to conduct strikes, they became the instruments of political power. Soviets of peasants were also formed. Tsar yielded and announced his manifesto granting freedom of speech, press and association, and conferred the power to make laws upon an elected body called the Duma. Tsar's manifesto contained principles which would have made Russia a constitutional monarchy like England. However, the Tsar soon relapsed into his old ways. No longer could one hope for gradual reform. Causes of 1917 revolution. Hoping to satisfy his imperial ambitions by annexing Constantinople and the Straits of the Dardanelles, the Tsar took Russia into the First World War. This proved fatal and brought about the final breakdown of the Russian autocracy. The Tsarist state was incapable of carrying on a modern war. The decadence of the royal family made matters worse. Nicholas II was completely dominated by his wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna. He, in turn, was deeply influenced by a mystic named Rasputin who virtually ran the government. Corruption in the state resulted in great suffering among the people. The government was completely unmindful of the conditions of soldiers on the front. By 1917, 600,000 soldiers had been killed in war. There was widespread discontent throughout the empire as well as in the army. The condition was ripe for a revolution. In setting forth the fundamental law for a successful revolution, Lenin had included two conditions: the people should fully understand that revolution is necessary and be ready to sacrifice their lives for it, and the existing government should be in a state of crisis to make it possible for it to be overthrown rapidly. Tune had certainly arrived in Russia in 1917. February Revolution 1917. Minor incidents usually set off revolutions. In the case of the Russian Revolution, it was a demonstration by working-class women trying to purchase bread. General strike of workers followed, in which soldiers and others soon joined. On 12 March 1917, the capital city of St. Petersburg fell into the hands of the revolutionaries. Soon the revolutionaries took Moscow, the Tsar gave up his throne, and the first provisional government was formed on 15 March. The most important demands of the people were fourfold: peace, land to the tiller, control of industry by workers, and equal status for the non-Russian nationalities. The provisional government under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky did not implement any of these demands and lost the support of the people. Lenin, who was in exile in Switzerland at the time of the February Revolution, returned to Russia in April. Under his leadership, the Bolshevik Party put forward clear policies to end the war, transfer land to the peasants, and advance the slogan "All Power to the Soviets." Lenin had described the Russian Empire as a prison of nations and had declared that no genuine democracy could be established unless all non-Russian peoples were given equal rights. He had proclaimed the right of all peoples, including those under the Russian Empire, to self-determination. Popularity of the Kerensky government led to its collapse on 7 November 1917, when a group of sailors occupied the Winter Palace, the seat of the Kerensky government. Leon Trotsky, who had played an important role in the 1905 revolution, returned to Russia in May 1917. As head of the Petrograd Soviet, he was one of the most outstanding leaders of the November uprising. An all-Russian Congress of Soviets met on the same day and assumed full political power. This event, which took place on 7th November, is known as the October Revolution. The Congress of Soviets on the next day issued a proclamation to all peoples and belligerent states to open negotiations for a just peace without annexation and indemnities. Russia withdrew from the war, though formal peace was signed with Germany later, after ceding the territories that Germany demanded as a price for peace. Following the decree on land, the estates of the landlords, the church and the Tsar were confiscated and transferred to peasant societies to be allotted to peasant families to be cultivated without hired labor. Control of industries was transferred to shop committees of workers. By the middle of 1918, banks and insurance companies, large industries, mines, water transport, and railways were nationalized, foreign debts were repudiated, and foreign investments were confiscated. A Declaration of the Rights of Peoples was issued conferring the right of self-determination upon all nationalities. A new government, called the Council of People's Commissars, headed by Lenin, was formed. These first acts of the new government were hailed as the beginning of the era of socialism. The October Revolution had been almost completely peaceful. However, soon the new state was involved in a civil war. The officers of the army of the fallen Tsar organized an armed rebellion against the Soviet state. Troops of foreign powers, England, France, Japan, United States and others, joined them as new government has refused to honor debts of Russian Empire. War raged till 1920. By this time the Red Army of the new state was in control of almost all the lands of the old Tsarist Empire. Red Army was badly equipped and composed mainly of workers and peasants. However, it won over better equipped and better trained forces. Consequences. The overthrow of autocracy and the destruction of the aristocracy and the power of the church were the first achievements of the Russian Revolution. Empire was transformed into a new state called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, for short Soviet Union. Policies of the new state were to be directed to the realization of the old socialist ideal, from each according to his capacity, to each according to his work. Private property in the means of production was abolished and the motive of private profit eliminated from the system of production. Economic planning by the state was adopted to build a technologically advanced economy at a fast rate and to eliminate glaring inequalities in society. Right to work became a constitutional right, and it became the duty of the state to provide employment to every individual. Education of the entire people was given a high priority. Equality of all the nationalities in the USSR was recognized in the constitution framed in 1924 and later in 1936. The constitution gave the republics formed by the nationalities autonomy to develop their languages and cultures. In its impact on the world, the Russian Revolution had few parallels in history. Ideas of socialism which the socialist movement had been advocating and which the Russian Revolution espoused were intended for universal application. It was the first successful revolution in history which proclaimed the building of a socialist society as its objective. Comintern, 1919-43, Communist International, also known as the Third International or Comintern, was formed for promoting revolutions on an international scale. Left-wing sections in many socialist parties now formed themselves into communist parties, and they affiliated themselves to the Comintern. Communist parties were also formed in other countries, often with the active involvement and support of the Comintern. The international communist movement arose under one organization which decided on policies to be followed by all communist parties. With the formation of the Comintern, the socialist movement was divided into two sections, socialist and communist. There were many differences between them on the methods of bringing about socialism and about the concept of socialism itself. Despite these differences, socialism became one of the most widely held ideologies within a few decades after its emergence. The spread of the influence of socialist ideas and movements was in no small measure due to the success of the Russian Revolution. Growing popularity of socialism and many achievements made by the Soviet Union led to a redefinition of democracy. Most people who did not believe in socialism also began to recognize that for democracy to be real, political rights without social and economic rights were not enough. Economic and social affairs could not be left to the capitalists. Popularity of socialism also helped to mitigate discriminations based on race, color, and sex. Many problems which were considered national began to be looked upon as concerns of the world as a whole. Universality and internationalism, which were fundamental principles of socialist ideology from the beginning, were totally opposed to imperialism. The Russian Revolution served to hasten the end of imperialism. New Soviet state came to be looked upon as a friend of the peoples of the colonies, struggling for national independence. Russia after the revolution was the first country in Europe to openly support the cause of independence of all nations from foreign rule. Between WW1 and WW2. Europe BW Wars, Germany was proclaimed a republic, which didn't satisfy some revolutionaries. Two socialist leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, were assassinated. Inspired by the Russian Revolution, there were revolutions in many other countries of Europe such as Hungary, Finland, and Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, which had earlier been parts of the Russian Empire. But all these revolutions were short-lived. Political situation in almost every country in Europe was complicated. This period saw the growth of socialist and communist parties in almost every country of Europe. However, within a few years in many countries of Europe, the socialist movements were defeated and dictatorial governments came to power. Fascism in Italy. Number of political movements which arose in Europe after the WW1 are generally given the name fascist. Common features of these movements were their hostility to democracy and socialism, and the aim of establishing dictatorships. They succeeded in many countries of Europe, such as Hungary, Italy, Poland, Portugal, Germany, Spain. Fascism movement started in Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had organized armed gangs against socialists and communists in 1919. Italy had joined WW1 with the aim of gaining colonies. However, the peace treaties had failed to satisfy its ambitions. The Italian government at the time was dominated by capitalists and landlords who began to support anti-democratic movements which promised to save them from the danger of socialism as well as to satisfy their colonial aspirations. Movement started by Mussolini was one such movement. Armed gangs were used by landlords and industrialists to organize violence against socialists and communists. A systematic campaign of terrorism and murder was launched, but the government showed little interest in curbing it. 1921, elections were held in Italy. Socialists and communists won 138 seats and Mussolini's party could get only 38. However, he marched on Rome in 1922 and seized power without firing a shot. Victory of fascism in Italy was neither the result of a victory in elections nor of a popular uprising. The government of Italy was handed over to the fascists because the ruling classes of Italy considered democracy and socialism as threats to their power. Takeover of the government by fascists was followed by a reign of terror. Socialist and communist movement was suppressed. In 1926, all political parties except Mussolini's party were banned. Fascists believed that there could be no harmony between two or more nations. Glorified war which, according to them, ennobled people. Openly advocated a policy of expansion and said that nations which do not expand cannot survive for long. Nazism in Germany had sought to satisfy her imperial ambitions through WW1 but suffered defeat. Outbreak of revolution in Germany towards the end of the WW1 led to the collapse of the German monarchy. However, even though Germany became a republic, the forces behind the monarchy, the industrialists, the big landowners, and the officers of the army remained quite powerful. Government was not able to destroy their power. These forces began to turn to the anti-democratic forces represented by Nazism to extend their power and to check the power of the socialist movement. Adolf Hitler too tried to capture power through a march on Berlin, but was captured and jailed. The Hall Putsch of Munich in November 1923 gave Hitler recognition worldwide, time to write in jail where he wrote Mein Kampf and moved him to change